Panel, an oil and money staple, looking at the changing global and regional geopolitical environment. And to moderate the panel, I'd like to invite Herman Franssen back to the stage with his panelists. Herman, over to you.
We have three really excellent members of this session. Nice thing is different backgrounds, different nationalities, which helps when you're talking about the changing global and regional geopolitical environment. We have Alastair Crooke here, director and founder of Conflict Forum, with enormous experience in the Middle East in particular. We have Fyodor Lukyanov, chairman of the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. He brings, of course, a great deal of background and expertise in Russia and understanding Russia from the Russian perspective, which is extremely helpful when we're discussing these global issues. And then the third one is Ambassador Freeman, a quite unusual person in the sense that he is both an expert on China, was involved in the early days from President Nixon, helped open up China to the United States, but he's also been ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War. So also has a very interesting background. So what I would like to start with is a little bit more general opening, and then we go into the more regional issues. And the general opening is follows, and I hope that all three of you can comment on that briefly. What foreign policy experts call the liberal international order, in fact the Pax Americana, which was constructed after 1945, and rested on the foundation of predominant US power. In 1945, the US controlled 2/3 of world gold and currency reserves. It was half of the world GDP, and therefore, at that time, could basically help develop the institutions created based on what they had in mind. The National Monetary Fund, NATO, World Trade Organization, and so on. Now, that is changing. We have now we had some short-term challenges in the 70s by Japan. We thought at that time they would become the prominent world financiers. 1989 changed that. The Soviet Union, a big challenge geopolitically to the United States, that changed with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then you had people talking about this as a new world in which the US will remain predominant for decades and decades to come. Now we see the challenge of China economically, very strong challenge of China, and also beginning geopolitically in their backyard in East Asia and eventually elsewhere as well. And we see Russia having been surrounded by rockets from the West on its borders, beginning to assert itself increasingly, and not only in the near abroad, but also in the Middle East. So how, maybe let's start with you, Alastair, how do you see this kind of rebalancing, and does it bring in also challenges, and potentially serious challenges, as it did after the First World War, in the 1930s in particular, when the established order also was under threat?
We saw just recently President Xi of China, when he was addressing the annual conference of the Communist Party in China, predicted quite provocatively, and he said, a financial crisis is coming, global financial crisis is coming soon, and also Europe is going to break up. And he said essentially, out of this crisis would be the mother and father of a new global order emerging. And he suggested that that global order would be now led in the future by Russia and China. He was very clear that he was not suggesting there would be one hegemony replaced by another hegemony. It was to be that this Russia and China would be the sources, if you like, of thinking and growth for this new order to come. But I think what we're seeing now, in fact, we've had a lot of language about volatility, but this was mostly about volatility of oil price. But what I think we're seeing at this stage is a huge volatility both in politics and in markets. And that can lead very easily to the dangers of political shock or indeed financial shock. Why financial shock? Particularly because I think many investors and hedge funds are very defensive. And so we may find that if there is political shocks or unexpected things, everyone will be heading for exits at the same time because people are nervous and defensive. I think in terms of political shocks, we have three major ones that we're facing that could be the crisis, if you like, that will bring about a shift in the global order. The first one is in the United States. I don't want to go into this because we have Charles who's going to speak to it, but just to say, as someone already said, this is a most polarizing election that is taking place in the United States. We know that. But actually what we're also seeing is the disaggregation of American government. We have, if you like, the Department of Defense saying, oh, well, yes, that's the president's point of view, but it's not the Department of Defense policy. We have the US Treasury saying, oh, yes, the president has said that and that's his view, but this is not the Treasury, US Treasury policy. This has been a time when the United States has been bitterly divided over foreign policy, almost irreconcilably divided if you come to Middle Eastern policy during this time. So I think it's a period where we may see, in the aftermath of a very polarizing and divided nation, also divisions within the government and the inability to take decisions. I would say the same is also true for the European Union in a different way. As we saw and may recall in 2003, the crisis in Iraq and the decision of some states to go to war in Iraq paralyzed the EU from taking decisions. The ill feeling between Britain and France just stopped the ability. Now it's the migration crisis. Really, the ill feeling, the divisions over the migration crisis has really paralyzed any chance of decision making. Why is this a danger? Because I think we have major financial problems taking up. We all know about Deutsche Bank, Monte Paschi de Siena. I'm not sure that the EU is going to be able to manage these crises very well, to come to a common decision. They can't come to any common decision on the major threat of migration. And the EU is frightened that at the end of this month, migration will be back on the table again, dividing Europe and perhaps irretrievably splitting it in different directions. But I think the main danger of this crisis is what is happening in Syria. I think it's all known to everyone that actually Russia has put down a red line, a very clear red line about the future in Syria in this period, and said that anything that flies into Syria, be it a drone, an unmanned vehicle, or a manned aircraft, and threatens the government-controlled territory of Syria, we will shoot it down. If people didn't believe that or thought it was rhetoric, Russia has followed that up by putting S-400 surface-to-air missiles in it, and made it very clear that this is a serious approach. Of course, the question is whether you believe it or not. But this is where we are, because at the same time no one seems to hear this. It's really not heard at all. Question. What part of this is difficult to understand? Anyone that comes into that area, which is controlled by the Syrian government, will be shot down. Russia controls, if you like, the airspace over Syria, both physically and electromagnetically. And yet there is a cacophony of calls coming from America, some in Britain too, saying, no, we must have a no-fly zone, no, we must have a, if you like, no, we must have forces in the ground, we must consider, the Foreign Secretary of Britain just said the other day, we must consider carefully getting engaged militarily in Syria. People don't seem to be listening. President Putin repeated in St. Petersburg, and Fyodor will follow it up, but President Putin said very clearly, what part of this, he was addressing the Western press, he said, what part of this don't you understand, gentlemen? I mean, this isn't very difficult. Just join the dots. You know, if we continue down this path, not because anyone wants to, we will end up in war. Obviously, it's difficult to work out exactly the degree to which perhaps the Pentagon is anxious to get a bigger budget to catch up technologically. Obviously, Russophobia is being produced in order to, if you like, diminish the position of Trump politically. But also, I think it's not hard to detect real Russophobia in this, and a desire to see Russia put back in its place and to preserve, if you like, an American hegemony that some in the United States are feeling is eroding. Push back Russia, in fact, to the Yeltsin era. It is, if you like, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Who's going to back down? Is the United States going to back down and not pursue question of their threats in Syria? Or is President Putin and Russia going to back down? I think it's as dangerous as that. And I think what makes me more concerned than anything about that is that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were adults in the room, people, friends that some of us may know, like Bill Polk and others, who were arguing about de-escalation. When you look at the American election now, and the stand by Mrs. Clinton, who's going to be there if she's elected to be the president? Who's going to argue after this huge demonization of President Putin in Russia? Who's going to be saying, no, let us withdraw the missiles from Romania and Poland and start an effort of de-escalation? That is the question that we must all ask ourselves. What is going to be the prospect of that? Thank you.
Thank you, Alastair. Fyodor, can you give us the Russian perspective of this? It's part in the contents of my first question, and in part also with the warnings that President Putin has given that we may be moving towards war. And it doesn't appear that in the Western media you find very much attention being paid to it, and the public isn't really as much aware that such a danger exists.
Yeah, thank you very much, Herman, and thank you for invitation to be here. It's my third participation in Oil and Money, and that's quite interesting that each year the international situation is more and more exciting, to put it politely. So 2014 we discussed Russian intervention in Ukraine. 2015 we discussed launch of big-scale military operation, Russian military operation in Syria. This year we are far enough to discuss possible war between Russia and the United States. That's a big achievement. I think that this is a very important dynamics, not only because of escalation, but because of total mismatch of discussion. Because based on how I described it and what is discussed worldwide, it seems that Russia is in the middle of everything. Russia is so much important that Putin, who is, as Secretary Clinton said it in August in the electoral speech, godfather of all dark forces of nationalism worldwide or something. I think that Mr. Putin should be extremely pleased to hear that, because who could imagine him 10 or 15 years ago when he came out from nowhere and no one could understand what is this not very impressive guy, that he will be called in this way pretty soon. But I think this is one of profound problems in our attempts to understand situation, that we have completely different visions in Russia and, say, in the United States, and partly in Europe as well, on what is happening. From the Russian point of view, What happens now, be it in Ukraine, in Syria, in Libya, before, everywhere? This is a problem of order which Americans, or broader the West, tried to establish after the Cold War and basically failed, because this order never became accepted by all, never became efficient enough to deliver for settlement of most acute problems worldwide, both politically, geopolitically, economically, and in all terms. And what we see, okay, Russia as the biggest loser of the previous era, of course, is trying to be to recover as much as possible. That's why many moves are a bit overdone. But in fact, it's not only a Russian problem, it's a problem of many countries which less and less are ready to subscribe to the system. Americans and Europeans, but especially Americans, believe was absolutely okay and great after the Cold War. And this is a systemic problem, structural problem. In the United States, everything we hear, and Alastair mentioned that, is not about this structural problem, but is about one particular country and especially one particular leader. There is one trouble worldwide nowadays. Its name is Vladimir Putin. And this is a total mismatch of dialogue, of discussion, because if Americans believe that by removing Putin, everything else will be improved and corrected, while Russia, and to lesser extent, maybe not as vocal, but many other countries believe that it's completely different. It's profound, fundamental shift in international alignment of forces, in economic capacities, economic weight, financial system, and so on. Then we try to settle completely different problems. Secondly, I think it's very important to understand, and which is not understood in Russia well either, that in fact what Americans preached all the time after the Cold War about need of democratization, actually it did happen, but in a completely different way. It was not victory of liberal democracy in all countries, but it was spirit of democracy which emerged in the whole international system. And many countries which before never claimed to have to say or to have to do something, now they do. And no one knows, the big countries, including Russia, no one knows how to deal with this, because the international system is much more diversified. And I think that on the one hand, Russia and the United States are bitterly struggling against each other in the UN Security Council. At the same time, we are on the same side of barricades, because the rest of countries, they hate both of us equally for total inability to use privileges we obtained or we subscribed to ourselves after the World War II. And sooner or later, this big revolt of middle-sized countries against great powers will take place. We already can see some signs of that. And third remark, I think very important, since we are here in London. London is it still European Union, but on the way somewhere else. Anyway, this is Europe. And what makes me extremely worried as Russian is that Europe, European Union, or Europe as cultural and political entity, or Europe as setup of countries, totally disappeared from political scene. It does not exist. It does not exist in the Middle East. It does not exist even in Ukraine anymore. We see that despite all Normandy formats, but who is the main person to discuss? This is Victoria Nuland. When she comes to Moscow to discuss with Surkov and with some other person, this is important. Merkel, Hollande, sorry to say it, but this is just dinners and so on. And I think this is a tragic development, because during the Cold War, when the European Union or European community at that time was a staunch ally of the United States, of course, but even at that time, Europe found ways how to play independent role and to mitigate, to to neutralize some of very most dangerous situation, which is not the case at all nowadays. That's really tragic. The day when I learned that Boris Johnson was appointed Secretary of Foreign Secretary here, I understood to my big disappointment that United Kingdom decided it's not about international relations at all. And I think it's very bad.
Thank you, Fyodor. Well, Charles, you'll provide the American perspective, also taking into account the very soon changes in government.
Well, Alastair and Fyodor, although they didn't put it in exactly the way I would have, had said everything that I wanted to say, which leaves me no alternative but to address your original question, which was, as I recall, something about the emerging order. I think one way to think about this is that in 1945 or after 1945, there were two orders invented. One was led by the United States and its allies, primarily in Western Europe, later incorporating Japan. And the other was led from Moscow by the Soviet Union. And the Soviet order has disappeared. There is now no alternative to the Western order that was created in the end of the 40s. So the question is how to incorporate those who were once outside that system, how to allow the system to adjust and adapt to an evolution in global affairs in which the Pax Americana is basically gone. And we're not doing very well at that. If you doubt that, consider the American passive-aggressive rejection of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or our keeping the BRICS at arm's length. And we now have a situation in which interactions between ourselves and the Russians, and don't feel alone, Fyodor, because the Chinese are also in the running to resolve our enemy deprivation syndrome, which is something we've been suffering from since the end of the Cold War. The Russians basically have been put in a position of having to reject much of the political economic order that we pioneered. They're kept outside it. The Chinese reject the ideology of democracy. And so we have a problem we are not solving. There's no center to the world at the moment. Nobody's in charge. There is devolution of authority and power to the regional level, and the United States hasn't really understood this. We are, as Alastair said, divided very badly, polarized. Some people get it, others don't. And we're dominated by narratives of one sort or another, which both of you basically articulated. We are having an election which is a national disgrace in our viewpoint, between Mr. Trump, who, like a clock, stopped, he's right twice a day. He's all complaints and no plans. Against him is someone who proposes to do more of the same, but with an additional military component. More of the same is going to yield more of the same. So this is not a happy prospect. I'm not going to get into Syria or the East China Sea or the South China Sea. I assume we'll get to those subjects in somewhat more detail later. But I do think that the analogy to a possible Cuban Missile Crisis is not a far-fetched one in either context. And those of us who lived through that, after having earlier lived through apprehension about mutual assured destruction and the annihilation of the species, recall it with horror. I think, Alastair, you were too kind about what happened inside our government, and I think on the Russian-Soviet side as well, it was far closer than many understand. And we lucked out. So that experience, if it is repeated, is nothing that anyone should want to have to go through. A final point. While all this is going on, there is one great strategically transformative effort being made. It's called One Belt, One Road. And it is an effort essentially to connect all of the Eurasian landmass from Vladivostok to Lisbon and from Moscow to Colombo in one great network of economic corridors, transportation, communications, and the like. And if it succeeds, it will transform the global geopolitical situation beyond all recognition. So it's not that there isn't a vision for the future. It's not being put forward by Russians, it's not being put forward by Americans, and it's not being put forward by Europeans. It's being put forward by the Chinese.
I have a few short questions. One I think is very important is the United States may be superior in not only in military strength to any other country in the world, but also the strength of the dollar, of the currency. Has given it unprecedented power, as we have seen with the sanctions against Russia, the sanctions against Iran, how important that power is, being the key currency. Well, in the 1970s, we thought Japan might take over that role from the United States sometime in the 1980s, but then their economy went down from 1989 on. In 2007, Alan Greenspan predicted that the distinct possibility that the euro would replace the dollar as the key currency. Now we know today where the euro is. Now we are expecting that the renminbi will become the currency replacing the dollar as the key currency at some point in the future. But there are also a lot of weaknesses in that system, as we all know. So I want a quick view from the three of you what you think, because those who control the global economy through financial system, of course, have power way beyond their borders. You want to start with that?
Yeah, I'd just say that the assumption that we're going to replicate a world in which a single hegemonic power runs everything has no evidence behind it. Much more likely, we're headed for a world in which many power centers will combine and compete. And this is true in the financial sector as well as in other sectors. That is to say, the renminbi will not replace the dollar. The dollar will have to yield ground to the renminbi and maybe the euro if it comes back. And we will have a system which is far more decentralized than the one we have been used to. And militarily as well, there are now competing power centers, centers of military innovation in many countries, and there will not be a single dominant country that enjoys military primacy. So all of this is by way of saying that we have to get used to a world in which we are simultaneously, and this goes to something Fyodor said, we're simultaneously the partner and the adversary of every other country. Alliances now are not evidence of common values and shared fears. They are mechanisms for cooperating when the parties consider it to their advantage to do so. The ad hoc coalitions we've been seeing are the wave of the future. And we have to get used to the idea that we will be cooperating with a country on one issue, at the same time we're going at it hammer and tongs on another.
Does that imply we're going back to a system that's more reminiscent of 19th century Europe, of power balance between various empires and shifting alliances, rather than what we have had
Yes, I
in
think
the
so.
20th century?
I think so. And the question is whether we can manage this. And I will say that my own country is particularly ill-equipped to do so mentally because we've never experienced this system. We were isolated by choice and by geography, and we became the world's greatest power only in World War II. So our formative experience is the bipolar world order and then the unipolar moment that followed it. And we're not coping well with the emergence of this more decentralized universe.
like to go back to the Middle East now, because I haven't really said much about the Middle East, and there are really two questions, but I'll start with the first one. We see the enormous changes in Syria, particularly since 2015, when Russia became involved in the struggle. We now see that the way things are developing, it appears that Aleppo will eventually be controlled by the Syrian government. It seems to move in that direction. Now we have the Iraqi government and various coalitions attack on Mosul. The outcome is probably that the Daesh will be removed from Mosul, but that does not mean the end. I'd like to start with you, Alastair. How do you see this developing, both in Syria, assuming that East Aleppo will eventually succumb to government forces, and a kind of post-Mosul Iraq?
At the beginning of August, we had the long-expected and long-planned Plan B of the United States, the one that Kerry had warned would be coming if there wasn't a political agreement earlier. And Plan B involved a major assault on Aleppo. And to that end, there were thousands of jihadists who were prepared, who were armed by the United States, and who were trained by the Turks for this exercise. And the aim was to come up to Idlib and to take Aleppo. I just emphasize that because we keep talking and hearing about human rights and the suffering of Aleppo. But this immense operation to try and shift the Syrian context militarily after the failure of the first ceasefire, which was promised by the United States, as it unfolded, the leaders made it quite clear their intention was to take Aleppo, the whole city. I just want to emphasize that because imagine what had happened if that had succeeded. If the Christians and all the other minorities of Aleppo had been taken by al-Nusra and its supporting forces, the consequences for the wives and the children of Christians and other minorities in Aleppo is not worth thinking about. But that was the Plan B. I think the question has been, for many people and now answered, was there ever really a Plan A? In fact, the Plan B has now failed for one particular reason, and that is because the United States is not able to and cannot, if it wanted, clearly it didn't want, but cannot separate those forces that are called moderate from Al-Qaeda. There is ample evidence that those groups will not be separated and cannot be separated. So we have had now, and moving beyond that political stage, to the logical alternative is that the Syrian government and Russia together are relieving the al-Nusra siege and insurgent siege of eastern Aleppo. I think that'll happen quite soon. In a sense, perhaps not surprisingly, now the focus has been pushed towards Mosul. And it's a useful diversion, perhaps, from Aleppo and the consequences of the failure of American policy in Syria at that point. But Mosul is not going to be an easy exercise because land has been taken by some groups. Kurds have taken some land before, and others want, as part of the solution to Mosul, that land and those areas that have been taken to be returned to their original owners beforehand. It's going to be a very difficult exercise to complete. Probably the easiest part of it is the expectation that ISIS will melt away and move to Raqqa. But just let me make quite clear why it's going to be a source of instability for the future. Iran, parts of Iraq, and Syria will never accept a pro-American, pro-Israeli wedge stuck in the middle of the Euphrates Valley, controlled by Barzani. It's not going to be acceptable to the region. And I think one of the big changes that we see that hasn't existed for decades now is for the first time none of the regional parties, Syria, Iraq, Iran, including Russia in this, are prepared to play the Kurdish card against any of the other partners. Before, always Iraq played the Kurdish card against Iran, or someone played the Kurdish card. Now there's general agreement that the American plan to establish a Kurdish enclave is not acceptable to those states. And therefore, I don't think it is going to work in the way people hope it will work. So I think we will find that it is much more complex and much more problematic than perhaps is being perceived in this case. They are not going to have, if you like, a new island of a pro-Western state put in the middle of right in the middle of what is known as the Shi arc.
Fyodor, Russia has been quite successful in its intervention and its support of Assad's government. And beyond that, Putin's government has gained a lot of additional respect elsewhere in the Middle East. And of course, you have the beginning of a realignment with Turkey. What do you see as Russia's endgame in Syria and its broader policy for the region?
That's a question which is usually asked by all, starting from many people in Russia who don't understand what the end game might be, and of course throughout the region. I think that the nature of Russian operation in Syria did change step by step since the beginning of intervention, because the initial intervention was motivated by many different aspects, starting from very officially articulated, openly said that Islamic State, if not defeated there, will pose rapidly increasing threat to Eurasia and to Russian territory, to Central Asia, which is absolutely true. And of course it was part of an attempt to clearly demonstrate to Americans that the era of regime changes as solutions for local, regional problems is over. So forget about this. Libya was, so to say, Russia was fed up after Libya. It's still unclear why then-time President Medvedev decided not to veto this military intervention in Libya, but whatever was his motivation, it's now seen in Russia as a total failure of Russian diplomacy. And Syrian position from the beginning, diplomatic position and military position, was to a large extent product of this Libyan experience. But step by step, unfortunately, I think to all of us, including to Russia, this situation changed into a proxy war. Now we are there. This is mentally a Cold War style mutual perception between Russia and the United States in the area. This is much more about status and prestige than about particular issues for both sides, which on the Russian side, it does not contradict the whole, so to say, philosophy of Russian resurgence in recent years. But I would say that obsession with the idea that we should prevail start to be more important than any practical and pragmatic issues which used to be guide Russian position before. And I think in Russia, inside Russia, many experts start to question this line. At the same time, as Alastair said, Putin wanted to achieve an agreement with Americans. That was early this year, that was recently in August, September. And both Lavrov and Kerry made enormous effort and spent so much time. And I think resentment today is partly a result of this helplessness that after such a big work, everything gone to hell. So in this regard, I think that initially Russia is not about to, so to say, to control the Middle East or to replace the United States there. But the more we are involved in this proxy war, the more dangerous it is. About Endgame, I don't think that Russia ever would think about to play same role in the Middle East as Soviet Union did. So whatever Russian generals, who of course now are very much inspired by cause of events, they love to war, to fight, but it's not the case that Russia is, so to say, dreaming about restoration of previous status. But coming back to my first remark, to show to the United States that the order they believe is immense and is indispensable, established after the Cold War, this order has gone. And this is the one of guiding lines.
I had another question for you.
Oh, well, that's all right. I have 5 very quick points, if I can make them. First, Aleppo is Grozny. That is the approach that's being used. Second, the fall of Mosul will result in hundreds of thousands of refugees. Think about it if you're in Europe. Third, we don't know what the end game is for anybody. Every party to this struggle in Syria and more generally in the Middle East has failed to address 2 questions. And then what? And second, how does this end? What is the war termination strategy? There is none. Finally, 2 quick points. The responsibility to protect, which was a theory of reduced sovereignty, died in Libya and has been buried in Syria, notwithstanding some die-hard advocates of it. And finally, I think what we're seeing in the disgusting spectacles in Iraq and Syria is that we don't understand the issue of Islamist terrorism at all. These people are not theologians. They don't know anything about the religion they profess. They are powerless young men and women who have found a way to cure their powerlessness by joining a community of criminals. And the great thing about this is that you can acquire religious credentials without going through the tedium of actually having to read the Quran or study the religion you profess. So this is perfect for misfits, and that's what they are. Sorry, Herman.
No, that's fine. But I wanted to go back because we're already nearing the end of the session. Basically, the United States has basically failed in Iraq. It's failing in Syria, but there's still enormous stronghold in the region, and particularly focused on the GCC, the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, with military bases in the Emirates, Oman, and so on. How do you see now, with a lot of problems occurring in the relationship between the US and not the last one? The last one was the ability now that Congress passed for people to sue Saudi Arabian officials, government, for possible participation or knowledge of the 9/11 disaster. But a lot of other issues, the Yemen war and so on. How do you see US relations developing under new administration, whoever wins, in Saudi, in particular with the GCC? And what we heard this morning from Khaled Al-Faleh, if Vision 2030 does not succeed, what is likely to happen in Saudi Arabia?
Well, those are very simple questions.
Very simple questions.
I think if we're honest, we have to admit that a series of blunders by the United States, the invasion and occupation of Iraq, regime removal not followed by regime change, the gleeful acceptance of the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak, the encouragement of chaos in Syria, the failure to manage the emerging Saudi-Iranian geopolitical and theological dispute, have all left the U.S. relations with the GCC in a state of estrangement. We're both very dissatisfied. The GCC has been attempting to diversify its international relationships to reduce dependence on the United States. That's not bad, but the problem is there is no alternative to the United States as a projector of power into the region. So we're stuck together in a very uncomfortable relationship. I could add Egypt to this picture. You see the countries of the region, including Israel, by the way, from which we are also estranged, reaching out to whoever they can find to offset reliance on the United States. What will happen? Well, a great deal depends on who is elected, I suppose, or does it? Because on issues in the Middle East, we have Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Trump are aligned. They are essentially one candidate, candidate clump. The candidate clump is on the payroll of the major donors of the Israel lobby. So whatever happens in the short term, Israel wins. In the long term, I would argue that an Israeli win is an Israeli loss, but that's a more sophisticated issue. Both of them seem to be enamored of responding to what they misunderstand as a theological challenge with bombs and drones. No change. There's no evidence that anyone around them has a more sophisticated or workable plan for addressing the various issues that have emerged in the Middle East. And I have to say, I believe Mr. Putin has maneuvered quite brilliantly in Syria, but that is not the result of a plan, but it is reaction to opportunities which he has seized, many of which my own country has created. So I don't know the answer to your question, Herman. I think everybody is perplexed, both in Washington and in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi and in Doha. And the only country that seems to know what it's doing is Oman, and its ruler is on his last legs.
What we heard throughout this conference, oil prices are going to be relatively low for quite some time to come. So the GCC countries, in particular the large ones, have to really adjust, and 2030 is such a plan. What can you say something about it, Alastair?
I'd like to say for much of North Africa and the Middle East, when you squeeze the oil price, you squeeze everything. Everything is connected with it. It's not a sense in which it sort of is good for consumers. Everything suffers, and I don't think I need go further on that with the audience that we have here. But there is more to that. I think that this crisis is also reflected. You asked about the end of the international order, but we are seeing the driver is probably be the fact that the globalized, neoliberal, financialized system is no longer working. Quantitative easing, negative interest rates, we all know that it's not producing growth any longer. It's not producing prosperity. That's been evident in the Middle East for a long time already. Yes, there's been so-called growth, but it's been for a few, and many have been without growth. So it's not surprising that we are having this huge migration crisis coming to Europe. And now, if the discontents of globalization have reached our own countries with many people, and this is also in America with the Trump phenomenon. And this is going to be the thing, because it's not only failing, if you like, economically, but it's failing politically too. It's not providing people what they want. If you're a 40-year-old anywhere in Europe, you'll find that you're getting a letter soon from your pension provider saying instead of 50,000 a year, you'll only be getting 18,000 a year because of negative or low interest rates. So it's going to be a time bomb politically for Europe if we continue with this model in terms of negative or zero interest rates.
Fyodor, you had the last comment?
Yeah,
I don't know what will happen by 2030. It's not my area of expertise, but I think we have experienced extremely dramatic development in recent years in the region. Local players used to claim all the time that outside forces did intervene and destroyed everything, which was pretty correct, starting from Sykes-Picot and so on. Then, at the same time, local powers tried to arrange it by themselves and failed miserably. And they actually, by claiming that outside forces are wrong, they are trying to attract them to act there. And now we see that outside forces are failing as miserably as local players. And in this regard, I'm sure that by 2030, the Middle East will look completely differently. Also in terms of alliances and relationships, and I absolutely agree with Chess about the changing nature of relationships between states. Alliances like NATO will never emerge or will not emerge in the foreseeable future because there is no permanent ground. And Mr. Rumsfeld, who many years ago said mission defines the coalition, was blamed by everybody for undermining NATO, but now we see that he was right.
Could I,
Sassy had the last word.
on Vision 2030, which you asked about, many years ago, the late King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia, when he was crown prince, and I had a conversation about the Saudi economy and its connection with politics. And I said to him, you know, there's something very strange about your economy. If I take a piece of land in Nevada and I borrow money or use my own money to develop an industrial estate in a community, and I don't ask the state of Nevada or the federal government in the United States to do anything, it still puts a lot of costs on the government. They have to build police stations and take care of schools and wastewater and so on. And if you do that in Saudi Arabia, as you do, it costs you even more because you're subsidizing electricity and water and everything. But there's a difference. In the United States, if I do that, every penny I spend comes back in the form of taxes. What you spend, not one halala comes back in taxes because you don't have taxes. So how are you going to resolve this dilemma as demography marches forward? Can you remain forever dependent on a commodity whose prices vary enormously over time? And he said to me, you know, Chaz, there is an old rule of Arabian political economy. No representation without taxation. And he said, I'm prepared to give a parliament to people if they will pay taxes. And I have actually summoned people and discussed this with them, and nobody wants to pay taxes. But what is now happening in Saudi Arabia is that Prince Mohammed bin Salman is trying to address this issue. One must wish him luck. It's not easy. And I don't know many Saudis who are prepared to sacrifice personally for the vision of the kingdom that he has put forward, inspiring as it is.
Thank you, Charles. Well, please join me in thanking all of the three speakers for their very interesting session.